The night was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your chest until you can feel your own heartbeat in your ears. My name is Eli Thompson, I'm 44, and I've spent nearly half my life wandering the Appalachian trails, seeking the solace and clarity that only the deep woods seem to offer. That night, I found something else entirely. The White Mountains were alive in a way that isn't captured in postcards or whispered in travel blogs. The trees weren't just trees. They were witnesses, guardians of 1,000 untold stories, and I was about to add one of my own. I had parked my small, weathered camper at the edge of Valley Campground, where the river bends sharply around a grove of hemlocks, and a low mist had begun to curl through the valley. At first, it seemed ordinary, the kind of fog that rolls in after a long stretch of rain. But then it changed, thickening, deepening into a hue I can only describe as blood red, and I realized, with that familiar tightening in my chest, that I wasn't entirely alone. I remember the precise moment when I noticed the shapes moving within the fog. They weren't fully formed, more like shadows stitched from the darkness itself, stretching and twisting across the landscape. I tried to rationalize it, tricks of the lantern light, the angle of the moon, but the hairs on the back of my neck told me otherwise. Something was here. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, repeating the mantra I'd always used after years of solo camping. Observe. Don't panic. Survive. My hands were steady as I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting a pale line through the crimson haze, revealing the first clue that this was no ordinary night. Footprints. They were too large for a deer, too deliberate for any animal I recognized, and they led straight into the thickest part of the fog, disappearing as if swallowed whole. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that made my stomach twist. It was the kind of smell you don't forget. Half rust, half iron, all wrong. I crouched beside my camper, listening. The distant murmur of the river became a roar in my ears, and then I heard it. A whisper, barely audible, curling through the mist like smoke. My name. Just my name. Eli. It was soft, almost caring, but the way it lingered, repeated, made my instincts scream at me. I could feel every lesson from years of hiking and camping surfacing, the unspoken truths the locals never say in polite conversation, the warnings passed down in hushed tones about valleys that are alive at night. And I realized, as much as I wanted to run, that I had to confront it, had to understand it, or I wouldn't leave that fog the same man I had entered. I stepped into the mist, each footfall muted, each breath visible in the red haze. The world narrowed to the sound of my heartbeat and the crunch of leaves under my boots. Shapes moved at the edge of vision, vanishing when I tried to focus on them, but leaving a sense of intent behind them, as if they were testing me, measuring my courage, my resolve, and then abruptly it stopped. The fog parted just enough to reveal a clearing where the air was colder, heavier. In the center stood an old cabin, abandoned, walls warped and blackened by time. The door swung slightly, as though inviting me in or daring me to turn back. I felt a surge of fear, real and visceral, but also a strange curiosity. I had been here before, in places of solitude and beauty, but never like this. Never where the world itself seemed to be holding its breath, watching my every move. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and decay. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting jagged shadows across the floorboards. There was nothing alive, nothing moving, and yet I could feel the pulse of the place, a rhythm that matched my own heart. And then I saw it, a small carved symbol on the wall, faintly glowing as if the fog outside had seeped in. It was unfamiliar, jagged, almost angry. I pressed my fingers to it, and the air shifted, the whispering returning, this time a chorus, layering my name with others I didn't recognize. Panic rose, clawing at my chest, but I forced myself to remain still. It was a test of endurance, of presence, and I realized that my fear was not the enemy here. It was the key. Recognizing it, naming it, confronting it. That was survival. I left the cabin before the night truly swallowed me, guided by instinct and the dim light of my flashlight. The fog followed, rolling, folding, thickening into waves that seemed almost sentient. I stumbled across the uneven ground, senses sharpened, until I finally reached the edge of the campground, where the familiar sights of my camper and the river reassured me I was still tethered to the world I knew. And yet, something had changed. The forest had spoken, and I had listened. I understood then that some lessons aren't taught in comfort. They are learned in fear, in the liminal moments when your understanding of reality is challenged by the unknown. I had survived, yes, but more importantly, I had gained a humility, a recognition of forces far older and stranger than I could comprehend. By dawn, the blood-red fog had lifted, leaving the valley quiet, ordinary, and almost serene. I sat by my camper, exhausted, eyes tracing the river's edge where I had first felt the pull of the mist. The footprints were gone, the whispers silenced, but their memory lingered, a reminder that the forest holds stories no guidebook can contain. And as the sun broke over the peaks, scattering light across the moss and hemlocks, I realized that fear, when faced with honesty and courage, can transform into something profound. It sharpens your awareness, refines your spirit, and teaches the subtle art of listening, not just to the forest around you, but to the quiet instincts that guide you through life's uncharted paths. The memory of that night lingers, even now, like a scar etched into the folds of my mind. Weeks later, I would return to the same valley during daylight, trying to reconcile what had happened with reason, to find mundane explanations, a trick of light, mist, or my own imagination, but the signs were unmistakable. Where the fog had been thickest, the ground remained oddly compacted, the forest floor flattened as if some unseen presence had pressed itself into the earth. I walked those paths with care, noting the subtle differences in the trees, the way moss grew unevenly along certain trunks, and the faint, lingering scent of iron that refused to fade. Locals I spoke with later only offered cryptic warnings, half smiles and averted eyes, mentioning that Valley Campground had a reputation for shifting realities, for showing travelers things they weren't ready to understand. Some spoke of it in hushed tones. Others avoided the subject entirely, but all agreed that there were nights when the fog itself carried the valley's history, memories of misfortune, sorrow, and secrets long buried. As I camped on subsequent nights, I noticed the valley seemed to respond to my presence. Mist would gather in patterns that mirrored my movements, curling around the trunks of trees like smoke. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and on occasion, I felt a presence brushing past me. Not threatening, not aggressive, but observant. It was as if the forest had recognized my willingness to confront its mysteries, my acceptance that some things exist beyond reason and control. I began to speak aloud during these nights, narrating my actions, my thoughts, my fears, as though acknowledging them would anchor me to reality. It worked in a way that defies simple explanation. By naming my fear, by confronting the unknown rather than fleeing it, I found a fragile, uneasy balance between terror and comprehension. One night, while tracing the riverbank in the dim light of a fading sunset, I stumbled upon another clue. A cairn, carefully stacked stones, partially hidden in the brush. It was not the work of modern hikers, nor did it match any pattern I recognized from trail markers. On closer inspection, I noticed the stones were carved with symbols similar to those I had seen in the cabin. I crouched low, tracing the lines with my fingers, and a shiver ran through me. Here, the valley had left a message, one I didn't fully understand but could sense deeply. Respect the place, honor its history, and move with awareness. Every instinct I had cultivated over years of solo hiking suddenly converged into clarity. The importance of attentiveness, the discipline of observing the subtle shifts in nature, the courage to walk into discomfort rather than avoiding it. I spent hours in that moment, sitting beside the cairn, feeling the pulse of the valley, attuning to its rhythm. And slowly the fear that had gripped me that first night transformed. It did not disappear, nor did the fog's memory fade. Instead, it became a lens through which I could read the forest, interpret the unseen currents of its energy. When the wind rustled the leaves in a particular cadence, I could anticipate subtle changes in the terrain. When shadows flickered in unexpected ways, I moved with greater caution, noticing details I would have once overlooked. The valley taught me that fear is not a weakness, but a tool, a signal of the unknown that, if heeded, can guide survival and insight alike. The most profound lesson came quietly, as it often does in the woods. One evening, after days of careful observation, I witnessed the fog returning, rolling slowly through the valley as the sun dipped behind the mountains. This time, I did not panic. I stepped into it with intention, following the faint trails of red that shimmered in the dim light, letting my senses guide me. Shapes appeared at the edges of vision, whispers drifted on the wind, and yet I felt no urgency to flee. I understood now that the fog, the shadows, the voices, they were not trying to harm me. They were testing me, inviting me to perceive more deeply, to recognize the interconnectedness of all things in the forest, the river, the trees, the creatures, the wind. By embracing fear rather than resisting it, I had unlocked a new layer of awareness, one that allowed me to navigate the valley with a profound sense of presence. When I finally emerged from the fog, my camper in sight and the first hints of dawn breaking over the peaks, I realized that the valley had not just tested me, it had changed me. I carried with me a heightened intuition, a reverence for the unseen, and a reminder that every journey into the wild carries with it lessons that cannot be found in maps or guidebooks. The forest had revealed both its danger and its wisdom, and I knew that each step I took from that point forward would be guided by the memory of those crimson nights, the whispers in the mist, and the steady pulse of the unseen life around me. It is a lesson in courage, humility, and attentiveness that extends far beyond the trails, a teaching that I carry into every encounter, every path, every unknown I choose to face. By the time I packed up my camper and left Valley Campground, the red fog was gone, leaving the valley bathed in the gentle light of morning. I drove away slowly, savoring the final moments of that sacred, terrifying, and beautiful space. I could still feel the pulse of the forest beneath my feet, the whisper of its secrets in the back of my mind, and the quiet assurance that I had been tested and had emerged transformed. Fear, I realized, is not the enemy. It is a messenger, a bridge between the known and the unknown, a guide that leads us to the very edge of our understanding. And when we meet it with courage, curiosity, and respect, it opens a door to a world far richer, deeper, and more alive than we ever imagined possible. I remember the drive back down the winding mountain roads, fog clinging stubbornly to the hollows even as the sun rose higher, painting the peaks in gold and amber. My hands gripped the steering wheel, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding settling over me like a cloak. That night in Valley Campground had stripped everything away, comfort, certainty, illusion, and left me with something raw, something real. I had felt the pulse of the forest, heard its whispers, and seen its tests reflected in shapes and shadows, and in return it had offered me a gift, the clarity that comes only when you face what you cannot control. I thought about the locals' warnings again, their half smiles and quiet avoidance, and I finally understood they did not fear the valley in a superficial way. They respected it because they had been confronted by its truths, by the lessons it delivers to those who dare to walk its fog-laden paths. When I later recounted the experience to friends, most of them laughed, suggested I had been tired or imagining things, but they could not feel the residual tension still coiled in my chest, the way my senses remained finely tuned long after leaving. I learned to notice subtle shifts in the wind, the sudden quiet of the forest, the scent of iron in the air, not because I expected danger, but because the world itself carries messages for those willing to perceive. There is a rhythm to fear, a cadence to the unknown, and once you learn to listen to it, you find yourself navigating not only forests but life, with a heightened awareness and an almost sacred attention to the present moment. Each step is deliberate. Each decision informed not solely by logic, but by intuition sharpened by experience, by the knowledge that the world is far older and stranger than we often allow ourselves to believe. Weeks turned into months, and the memory of the blood-red fog remained a guidepost. Whenever I feel fear creeping into other aspects of life, work, relationships, uncertainty, I recall the valley at 3:08 a.m., the whispering shadows, the glowing symbols on cabin walls. And I remember that fear is not an enemy to be fought, but a companion to be understood, a signal of something beyond ordinary perception demanding attention, respect, and care. That night had taught me patience, resilience, and the discipline to move forward with awareness, even when my mind screams to retreat. I learned that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to meet it fully, to walk into it, and to allow it to transform you. Now, whenever I return to the Appalachians, I carry that night with me, woven into my steps, embedded in the way I see the mist curling over mountain ridges, in the way I notice footprints in the soil that do not belong to any creature I know. I speak softly to the forest as I hike, acknowledging its presence, its history, its power. I am no longer just a visitor. I am part of a dialogue that stretches back centuries, a conversation with the unseen, with forces that are patient, deliberate, and profoundly alive. And I understand that every moment of fear, every heartbeat in the dark, every whisper in the fog is not simply a challenge to endure, but an opportunity to grow, to perceive, to awaken to the hidden layers of the world. Looking back now, I realize that the valley has changed not only how I move through forests, but how I move through life. I have learned to honor intuition, to value patience, and to embrace the unknown with courage, curiosity, and respect. The blood-red fog was not a threat. It was an initiation, a reminder that the world is far larger, stranger, and more alive than we often allow ourselves to see. And as I stand at the edge of a new trail, watching mist curl around the trees and sunlight scatter across the peaks, I carry with me a profound truth. Courage is not measured by the absence of fear, but by the willingness to meet it, to listen to it, and to let it shape you into someone who sees the world with clarity, reverence, and unshakable presence. That is the gift the forest offered me that night, the lesson that continues to guide every step I take in the wild, and every choice I make beyond it. And when the fog rolls in again, thick and crimson, I do not run. I walk forward, heart steady, senses alive, knowing that I am part of something larger, something eternal, and that the deepest wisdom often comes wrapped in the guise of fear. And then, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks and the last rays scattered gold across the valley, I paused at the crest of a ridge, looking down on the campground that had haunted my night. The fog had returned, thinner now, curling like a living veil over the river and the trees, its red hue faint but unmistakable, as if the valley itself was breathing, alive and aware of my presence. In that moment, a profound clarity settled over me, a recognition that fear, mystery, and beauty are inseparable in the wild, that the very things that unsettle us carry lessons too deep for words, and that courage is not a trophy, but a dialogue with the unknown. I felt the pulse of the forest beneath my feet, the whisper of the wind through the hemlocks, the quiet insistence of the earth that life is always more complex, more alive, and far more strange than we dare to imagine. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp mountain air fill my lungs, and felt an unexpected gratitude, not for the safety of leaving the fog behind, but for having walked through it, unflinching, and having been transformed by it. Every fear confronted that night, every shadow that flickered just beyond comprehension, had become a teacher, revealing patience, presence, and the subtle art of listening. I understood that the world offers no guarantees, only invitations, to step forward, to engage, to meet life on its own terms, and to allow the mysteries around us to shape us, refine us, and awaken us to the depths of our own courage. As I descended the ridge, the valley stretching below me in a mosaic of green and gold, I felt both small and infinite, bound to the earth, yet part of something far beyond my comprehension. That night, the whispers, the footprints, the blood-red fog would never leave me, and I would never want them to. They are etched into my being, a reminder that every trail holds its own truths, every forest its own consciousness, and that to truly live, we must be willing to walk into darkness, to face the unknown, and to emerge not merely unscathed, but profoundly awakened. And so the White Mountains taught me what no map, no guidebook, no comfort of familiarity could ever convey. That fear is a companion, the unknown a mentor, and the wild a mirror in which we discover who we are when the lights go out, when the fog rolls in, and when the world whispers our name in the dead of night. That night, at 3:08 a.m., I did not simply survive. I became fully awake, fully present, and forever changed by the blood-red fog that moves through the valley and through all the moments of our lives where the unseen tests our courage, our resolve, and our capacity to listen to the world in its raw, unfiltered truth. The wind shifted in the valley, carrying a chill that seemed almost unnatural, slipping past my jacket and threading into my bones like it knew I was alone. I first noticed it while unpacking my gear, the quiet Appalachian evening punctuated only by the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional crow cawing somewhere far above. My name is Thomas Gray, 44, and I've been chasing solitude in the forests of Appalachia for more than a decade, trading the hum of city streets for the silent, living cathedral of ancient trees. I had driven hours to reach this particular patch of wilderness, a narrow clearing near Damascus that I had discovered years ago on an overgrown trail, the kind of place locals spoke of only in hushed tones or with knowing looks. Tonight, the moon was thin, almost absent, and shadows folded over themselves in the hollows like secrets waiting to be disturbed. I'd been meticulous, as always, setting my small camp with the precision of someone who respects the forest's quiet authority. The fire pit, a circle of scorched stone, was central to the clearing, and I arranged logs around it, imagining the soft crackle of flames that would soon illuminate the dark corners around me. I had eaten my modest dinner, the kind that doesn't leave crumbs to invite bears or curious raccoons, and by the time I had settled on my log, I felt the familiar pulse of peace that comes with being deep in the woods, alone but tethered to the land. Yet, something about this night felt off, subtle and indefinable, the kind of feeling that tightens your stomach without a sound, like the forest itself is holding its breath. Hours passed and the fire, which I had kept modest, began to die, orange embers glimmering weakly before succumbing to shadow. That's when I first saw it. A figure seated at the edge of my extinguished fire, still as stone. My mind recoiled, trying to rationalize. A local camper, perhaps, moving silently through the trees, or some trick of the low light, but there was no movement, no sound, only the unmistakable presence of something human-shaped, slouched slightly, as if resting or waiting. My heart caught in my throat, an animal part of me screaming to flee, yet another, older part of me, trained in countless nights in the woods, urging caution. I did not reach for my lighter immediately. I did not want to provoke whatever was there. I called out softly, a simple hello that sounded braver in my mind than it ever did when it left my lips. The figure did not respond, did not shift. My pulse quickened, the forest around me suddenly too loud, every snapping twig and whispering leaf amplified into a chorus of threat. I remember my eyes adjusting, tracing the edges of the figure, trying to make sense of it, the way the pale moonlight glanced off its shoulders, the vague outline of its head bowed slightly, as if in contemplation or mourning. For a moment, I imagined I was witnessing a ghost, not a living being, a fragment of the forest's memory made flesh. And yet, there was nothing ethereal about it, nothing that would convince me to step closer without fear. I took a slow breath, reminding myself of every lesson learned over years of camping in the Appalachian wilds. Fear is a visitor, not a master. I reached for my small flashlight and switched it on, letting a narrow beam cut through the darkness. The figure remained unnervingly still, and the beam revealed a face, gaunt and pale, eyes deep with a sorrow I could almost feel pressing into my chest. My mouth went dry. I had never expected to encounter another soul in this secluded corner, certainly not someone, or something, that seemed suspended between this world and another. My training, my instincts, screamed at me to stay seated, to appear calm, to not disrupt the fragile balance that hung in the forest air. Minutes stretched like hours. I spoke again, softer this time, telling the figure I meant no harm, that I was just camping. The shadows seemed to fold closer, the trees bending slightly as if listening. Then, slowly, it lifted its head. The eyes met mine, hollow yet searching, and I understood something profoundly human about fear and isolation. This was not a malevolent presence, it was a mirror of my own solitude, magnified and reflected back at me by the vastness of the Appalachian night. I realized then that the forest keeps stories, not just in the whispers of leaves or the gnarled shape of roots, but in echoes of those who have wandered here before, lost or waiting, and that these echoes can appear to those willing to see them. I could feel my own breath rising, visible in the chill, and I made a decision. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my pack for an extra blanket, moving carefully to leave space, to show that my intention was not to confront, but to acknowledge. The figure shifted slightly, a faint nod, almost imperceptible, as if accepting the gesture. I did not approach, and it did not move closer, but a subtle understanding passed between us, a shared respect for the quiet intensity of night, for the unspoken rules of survival in these woods. I could sense the forest exhaling with me, the tension in the air easing, a lesson delivered without words. Vigilance and empathy are not opposites, but companions in any wilderness. Hours later, the figure rose slowly, more shadow than substance under the waning moon, and moved into the trees, fading until it was gone. I remained by the embers, staring at the space where it had sat, the cold sinking deeper into my joints. I thought about my life outside these woods, about how often I moved through my days ignoring the unseen, the unheard, the subtle lessons of quiet observation. Here in Damascus at 9:44 p.m., I had been confronted not with danger alone, but with a delicate boundary between fear and insight. I learned that night that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to remain present and attuned, even when the shadows themselves seem alive. Morning came slowly, gray and misty, crawling over the hills like a hesitant awakening. I packed my gear with careful hands, glancing once more at the fire pit, still cold, still holding the memory of what had passed. The forest felt different in daylight, lighter yet no less profound, and I walked back toward my truck with a quiet reverence. That encounter did not diminish me, it expanded my understanding of solitude, of the layers of life that exist between the branches and beneath the soil. There is a rhythm here, I realized, a pulse of the living and the remembered, and it is only those willing to move gently, with respect and attentiveness, who can perceive it without fear consuming them. By the time I reached the edge of the clearing, the lessons had settled like sediment in my mind, heavy yet clarifying. I understood the Appalachian woods differently after that night, not as a backdrop for thrill or conquest, but as a mirror for self-awareness, a place where the limits of courage are tested not through danger alone, but through presence, observation, and the quiet, impossible beauty of knowing you are not entirely alone, even when you appear to be. The memory of that figure by the extinguished campfire remains with me, a reminder that every shadow has a story, every silence a voice, and that the deepest lessons are often encountered not in the heat of survival, but in the reflective stillness that follows. The forest did not simply release its hold on me as I drove away. It followed, threading its way into my thoughts, replaying the shape of that figure in the flicker of headlights and the curl of mist over the hills. The roads out of Damascus wound narrow and slick, lined with trees that seemed to lean closer with every mile, whispering reminders that some encounters do not end when you leave the clearing. I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel the shadow of that presence lingering, a subtle pressure on my awareness that was neither threatening nor comforting. Simply there, a weight of history, memory, and untold stories. By the time I reached the highway, I understood something I hadn't fully realized at the moment. The woods had tested me, but not in the way a predator might. They had tested my capacity to bear the quiet, to sit with the unknown without running, to respect what exists beyond immediate comprehension. I parked my van at a rest area, letting the engine idle while I collected myself, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline I had refused to acknowledge on the trail. I thought about how easy it would have been to dismiss the experience as a trick of light or fatigue, and I almost wanted to, almost reached for that comfortable rationalization. But the image of those hollow eyes bowed in sorrow or reflection would not let me. It had etched itself into my mind in such a way that ignoring it would feel like turning my back on part of the forest itself. The Appalachian night is full of stories that demand attention. Not loud, not insistent, but persistent in a way that penetrates the heart. I realize that sometimes the real danger in the woods is not being chased or trapped, but in leaving without seeing, without acknowledging, without learning the lesson whispered in silence. By the time I reached home, the sun had barely cleared the horizon, washing the suburbs in a pale, hesitant light that seemed almost foreign after the deep darkness I had left behind. I sat in my driveway for a long time, staring at the van, feeling the weight of the night settle into my chest like a second heartbeat. Every detail replayed, the embers fading to gray, the cold brush of wind over the clearing, the slow nod of acknowledgement from the figure that might have been ghost or lost traveler, or perhaps both. And then I understood. This is what the woods give, the gift of confrontation, not with monsters, but with the parts of yourself that remain untested, that tremble at uncertainty. Fear, I realized, is not merely something to survive. It is something to interpret, to listen to allow to illuminate corners of perception we normally avoid. That day, in the following weeks, I found myself thinking not of escape, but of presence. I returned to my journal, a worn leather notebook I carried to every campsite, and wrote every detail of the night, every sensation, every flicker of emotion. Writing it out, I began to see patterns, to understand the forest's subtle pedagogy. Vigilance is not paranoia, empathy is not weakness, and solitude is never emptiness. These lessons, learned in the cold and dark, in the fleeting recognition of something almost impossible to describe, became guides for the life I carried outside the trees. I moved through the world differently, slower, more attentive, more willing to confront discomfort without flinching. And yet, the memory of the figure lingered, a quiet reminder that there is a vastness in the world that cannot be tamed, only acknowledged. Months later, I returned to Damascus, drawn by something I could not name, driven by the need to see the clearing again, to feel that weight of presence, to measure the difference between fear and understanding. The forest had changed slightly, as all forests do, but the fire pit remained, blackened stone forming the same circle, waiting as if it had been expecting me. I sat in the same position, letting my eyes adjust to the shadows, half expecting nothing and yet fully prepared for everything. And then, in the same corner, I saw it again. Not fully, not in the form of a complete apparition, but a suggestion, a glimmer of presence that made the hairs on my arms rise and my heart beat with recognition. I did not move. I did not call out. I simply watched, and in watching, I understood. Courage is not the elimination of fear, but the willingness to face it with patience, awareness, and respect. The figure did not speak. It did not vanish abruptly. It simply was, a living question posed by the forest to anyone who would sit long enough to meet it. And in that moment, I understood why campers, hikers, and wanderers are drawn to the deep woods. Not just for isolation or escape, but for revelation. The forest tests us, it reflects us. It mirrors the cracks and strengths in our character that go unnoticed in the ordinary cadence of daily life. I rose slowly from my log, careful not to disturb the fragile silence, and walked the trail back to my van, carrying with me a profound stillness, a sense that the world is larger, stranger, and more intricate than I had allowed myself to admit. Fear, presence, and understanding had converged in that clearing, and I would carry the memory with me always, a compass pointing not north, but inward. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can see that figure sitting by the extinguished campfire, a reminder that life in the wild is as much about internal exploration as it is about external navigation. The shadow taught me that vulnerability and courage are inseparable, that to truly know the wilderness, one must also be willing to know oneself, with all the hesitation, doubt, and insight that entails. Damascus 9:44 p.m. will forever mark not just a time and place, but a threshold moment, a confrontation with something beyond simple comprehension, something that leaves its mark in ways subtle and profound. The forest, the figure, and the silence together offered me a truth that city streets, digital screens, and endless activity never could. Presence is the highest form of courage, and recognition of the unseen is the most enduring lesson of all. The days that followed were quiet but charged, as if the encounter had shifted something fundamental in the rhythm of my life. Walking through the ordinary world, the grocery store, the streets, the hum of cars, I felt a subtle distance from the noise, a kind of heightened perception that made the mundane seem almost translucent. Every shadow, every shift in light reminded me of Damascus, of that extinguished fire and the figure who had neither threatened nor comforted, but simply existed in the same space as me, forcing me to confront the fragile line between fear and understanding. I began to notice patterns in people, in nature, in the way small actions ripple outward, and I realized that the woods had trained me to see differently, to measure the weight of presence, and to listen for truths that are not spoken aloud. Months later, I returned to the forest again, compelled by something I could not define. The trail to the clearing was overgrown, the moss slick underfoot, the familiar tree roots twisting like old scars across the path. I moved slowly, deliberately, letting my senses absorb every detail. The distant call of a hawk, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves that always feels like a heartbeat beneath your feet. When I reached the clearing, I paused, my eyes immediately drawn to the fire pit, still blackened, still holding the echoes of that night. And there, seated with the same quiet weight of presence, was the figure, or at least the suggestion of it, its outline folded into the shadows. I did not startle. I did not reach for light or weapon. I simply sat, and for the first time I understood fully that courage is measured not in confrontation, but in patient acknowledgement, in the willingness to sit with what cannot be fully explained. Time in the woods moves differently. Minutes stretch and compress, and in that timeless space, I realized that this encounter had given me something precious. The knowledge that the world is layered, not just in the physical sense, but in the emotional and spiritual dimensions that most people ignore. The figure was not there to frighten me, nor to guide me. It was there to mirror my own isolation, my own fears, my own capacity for empathy and awareness. Sitting there, I felt the forest's pulse in tandem with my own, a reminder that life's deepest lessons are often silent, subtle, and waiting for the patient observer to recognize them. In that quiet communion, I found a strange serenity, a tremor of awe that ran through me, acknowledging that some truths can only be grasped when fear is faced and absorbed, not dismissed. Eventually, the figure rose, moving like a shadow peeling itself from the trees, and as it vanished, I was left with a profound stillness that seemed to stretch beyond the clearing, beyond the forest, beyond myself. It was an absence that was not empty, a space filled with understanding and reflection. I rose and walked the trail back to my van, feeling each step as a tether to the lessons of that night. Fear had not been obliterated, but transformed into vigilance tempered with empathy, into an attentiveness that would shape every moment I spent in the wild. That night had reminded me that the woods are not merely landscapes. They are teachers, holding mirrors to our inner lives, challenging us to see beyond the obvious, to honor the unseen, and to carry the quiet strength of awareness into every corner of our existence. When I finally drove out of Damascus, the sun sinking low over the ridges, I felt both humbled and exalted. The forest had given me a gift I could never repay, a lesson in the intersection of fear and courage, solitude and connection. It had shown me that the most profound revelations are not found in triumph or escape, but in the willingness to remain present, to observe, and to engage with the unknown without flinching. I understood now that every shadow, every silence, every abandoned clearing holds the potential to teach, if only we approach it with respect and attention. The Appalachian night, with its chill and its shadows, its ancient trees and hidden hollows, had changed me irrevocably. It had reminded me that to live fully, we must sometimes step into the darkness, sit with uncertainty, and allow ourselves to be seen, not just by the world, but by the parts of ourselves we usually keep hidden. Even now, when the city presses close and life seems urgent and unrelenting, I carry the memory of that extinguished fire and the figure who sat beside it. I carry it as a reminder that the lessons of the wild are not contained in maps or gear lists, not in survival tactics or hours logged, but in presence, patience, and the courage to face what we cannot yet explain. Damascus 9:40 p.m. was not a moment to be feared, but a doorway, an invitation to recognize the depth of our own perceptions, the fragility and strength of solitude, and the subtle, enduring power of attention. And in that recognition, I found not only understanding of the forest, but of myself, a quiet, resolute, unshakable awareness that life, in all its shadows and whispers, is richer when approached with openness, courage, and the willingness to witness what lingers beyond the light. The wind was heavier than usual that night, whipping through the ridges of the Smokies with a voice that felt almost human, carrying whispers of stories long forgotten. I remember standing on that narrow trail, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, the forest stretching around me like an endless cathedral of shadows. My name is Caleb, I'm 32, and I've wandered these mountains since I was a boy, learning the cadence of the trees, the hidden paths of wildlife, and the kind of quiet that feels like it could swallow you whole. But nothing in my years of camping, nothing in the careful rhythms I had honed, prepared me for what I stumbled upon that night. Something that would etch itself into the part of my mind that refuses to forget, that keeps me awake when the wind carries the wrong sort of story through my window. We had set up camp on the ridge around twilight, a small party of friends and fellow hikers, with our packs pressed close and a fire crackling low as dusk fell. The smoke trailed upward, disappearing into the folds of the mountains, and I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt. That peace, however, is a fragile thing in the Smokies, like the thin layer of mist hovering over a still pond, ready to shatter at the slightest disruption. Around 2:51 a.m., I woke to a sound that immediately snapped me out of sleep. A faint, static-laden hum, as though a radio had been turned on somewhere nearby. I froze, straining my ears against the usual night chorus. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the sigh of branches settling. But this was different. I followed the sound cautiously, my flashlight piercing the darkness in narrow slices, the beam falling on the familiar shapes of pines and ridges that moments ago had seemed benign. And then I saw it. A tent, perfectly ordinary in size and shape, set up along the edge of the ridge, yet strangely isolated from our camp. The zipper quivered gently in the wind, and inside, unmistakably, there was a radio playing static. It was an old, battered thing, the kind you might find in a forgotten cabin or the back of a dusty attic, and yet it sat there without a soul near it. My stomach clenched, that familiar knot of fear mixed with curiosity, and I couldn't turn away. Something about the quiet between the bursts of static made it feel deliberate, like the forest had a pulse, and this sound was a message meant only for the unprepared. I whispered to my friends, who had begun to stir from their tents, but the words felt inadequate to describe what I was seeing. It wasn't just a ghostly presence, it was a tangible puzzle. Why would a tent be here, alone, radiating a sound that was usually human, but now eerily inhuman? As I edged closer, my flashlight shaking slightly in my grip, I noticed the ground around it was untouched. No footprints, no disturbed pine needles. It was as if it had grown there overnight, a perfect anomaly in the natural order. And yet, instinct screamed at me, turn back. Yet curiosity pressed forward, a heavier weight, a gravity I could not resist. The radio crackled louder as I reached the tent, and the static shifted, almost forming syllables that teased comprehension, but slipped away before my mind could lock onto them. I knelt, feeling the chill rise from the wet earth, and placed a hand on the canvas. It was warm, unexpectedly warm, as if someone had been inside recently, someone who had just vanished. I remember my breath catching, the hairs on the back of my neck rising, and an awareness of how utterly alone we were on that ridge. The Smokies can swallow sound, swallow light, swallow presence itself, and in that moment I felt the mountain's gaze, patient and unyielding. I backed away slowly, careful not to draw attention, my friends now fully awake and staring, frozen in the eerie half-light. No one wanted to touch the tent, and no one wanted to leave it. That's the paradox of fear in the wild. It binds you, roots you to the earth, and yet tempts you to move, to act, to discover. The static seemed to pulse in response to our collective hesitation, a low, throbbing heartbeat of something beyond understanding. We debated retreating, hiking back down in the dark, but the trail was slick with dew and moonlight hid the gnarled roots ready to snare the unwary. I remember thinking, with a clarity only fear can provide, that sometimes the danger is not in what you see, but in what you imagine might be watching you from the folds of the ridge. Eventually, I approached again, this time with a purposeful step, driven not by courage, but by a need to know. I unzipped the flap slowly, expecting darkness, expecting emptiness. And there it was. Nothing. The tent was vacant, utterly, hauntingly so, but the radio hummed on, the static now almost melodic, a sound that could almost be described as a sigh or a whisper of lament. I touched it and the vibrations ran up my arm, a physical reminder that the world is filled with forces we rarely acknowledge, forces that do not need eyes to observe, that do not need hands to touch. The lessons of the Smokies are written in silence and shadow, and in that moment the mountain was teaching me something urgent, something ancient. I stepped back, and my friend Sarah, who had remained silent, whispered a question I wasn't ready to answer. "Do you think it's alive?" Her voice was barely audible, but it carried across the ridge, weaving with the static in an uncanny harmony. And the truth is, I didn't know. I couldn't say. But there was a weight, a presence, a consciousness behind the hum, something that insisted we acknowledge it, recognize it, if only for a fleeting heartbeat before the night claimed us again. I had always thought I understood fear, had cataloged it in careful journals and long treks through the unseen corners of the Appalachians. But this was different. It was intimate, invasive, almost personal, like a story that required participation, that demanded an audience. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, time stretched like taffy in the dense night. The wind shifted, and with it the static began to waver, its pulse slowing until it became a faint echo, fading into nothingness. By the time the first hints of dawn kissed the eastern ridges, the tent had vanished, leaving behind only a slight depression in the forest floor and the memory of a sound that would haunt me for years. We packed up quickly, not speaking much, each of us absorbed in the knowledge that the ridge had shared its secret and that the mountains had once again reminded us of their rules. Respect the unseen, honor the stillness, fear what cannot be seen but must be felt. I walk through life differently now. I notice subtle shifts in the wind, small anomalies in familiar spaces. The Smokies taught me that fear is not always a monster under the bed. Sometimes it is a message, a call to attention, a lesson veiled in static and shadows. I learned to trust instinct, to honor curiosity, but also to recognize the boundaries that nature, and perhaps something older, sets for those who wander too far without listening. That night, that 2:51 a.m. on Smokies Ridge did not just frighten me. It transformed me, reshaping my understanding of presence, of absence, and of the strange, intricate dialogues that exist between a person and the wild. The mountains will always whisper, always test the boundaries of what we believe is real, and for those willing to listen, they offer stories more profound than any written word. The radio static was gone, but its echo lives within me, a reminder that the deep woods are never truly empty, that every ridge holds a history, a consciousness, a truth waiting to be acknowledged, and in acknowledging it, we become part of a story larger than ourselves, one that humbles, frightens, and ultimately teaches us the raw, unvarnished beauty of paying attention to the world in its purest, most enigmatic form. And so we hiked down that ridge as dawn cracked the sky open with pale, trembling fingers, and every shadow we passed seemed alive, every rustle in the underbrush a possible echo of that empty tent and its ghostly radio. I could feel the tension loosening in my shoulders, but the tension in my mind remained, a gnawing awareness that some encounters in the wild do not end with footsteps or sunrises. They linger, settle into your bones, and demand contemplation long after the forest has returned to its quiet rhythm. I kept thinking about the impossibility of that night. No footprints, no person, no explanation. Only static, only that tent that seemed to exist for reasons beyond human comprehension. It was a puzzle I would carry with me, a question without an answer, and yet somehow it felt like a gift. A reminder that the forest holds wisdom if you have the courage to listen, and fear, when understood, can teach more than any safety manual ever could. As we reached the lower trails, I looked back up at the ridge. The sunlight had washed over it now, softening its jagged edges, and for a fleeting moment it seemed innocent, almost mundane. And yet I knew the truth. The ridge had not changed, our perception had. What had appeared supernatural at night was simply the mountain's own way of reminding us that we are temporary, fragile, and sometimes blind to the deeper rhythms of life. That awareness struck me as I breathed in the crisp morning air, wet with dew and pine, a sensation that was both invigorating and humbling. I realized then that part of hiking, camping, wandering in the deep woods is surrendering control, admitting that some stories exist without resolution, some presences without form, and some lessons without clarity. When we finally returned to our cars, everyone was quiet, each of us caught in our own reflection of the night. I felt a strange kinship with the forest, a connection that was unsettling but profound. In that emptiness, in that uncanny hum of a radio without an owner, I understood something fundamental. The world is alive in ways we rarely acknowledge, and life is measured not just in what we see or touch, but in what we allow ourselves to experience and question. My friends spoke sparingly about the event, hesitant, almost reverent, as though voicing it aloud might shatter the fragile truth we had glimpsed. We had confronted something inexplicable together, and in that shared acknowledgement, we found a silent, unspoken bond. I think back on that ridge often now, when I hike alone, when the wind carries a certain cadence through the trees, or when the night feels unusually still. There is a tension, a hum beneath the surface of ordinary life that reminds me of that empty tent, of the static, of the presence that demanded attention. It teaches patience, the importance of listening, and the humility to accept that not all questions have answers, not all fears have faces, and not all encounters can be neatly categorized or rationalized. The Smokies, in their quiet, relentless way, offer experiences like this, moments where reality bends just enough to remind you how much you have yet to perceive. And now I approach every hike differently. I move through the woods with heightened awareness, with respect for the spaces I enter and the histories they hold. I notice subtle patterns in the leaves, shifts in the wind, the distant cracking of branches that speak to more than just falling limbs. I have learned to pause, to observe, to feel the weight of the air around me. That ridge taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. It is walking forward despite it, allowing the unknown to expand your understanding of yourself and the world. The static of that radio was a call, not a warning, and answering it changed the way I engage with every moment, every silence, every shadow. There is a certain beauty in the unknowable, a sacredness in the stories that exist without witnesses, and an exhilaration in being present for them. The Smokies Ridge is not just a location on a map. It is a memory, a lesson, a touchstone for the interplay between fear and revelation. Standing there with the forest around me both alive and enigmatic, I learned that to truly experience the wild is to accept that some things will remain beyond understanding, that the mountains whisper truths in a language we may never fully grasp, but that listening, truly listening, is the reward. As we left the forest behind, I felt a transformation that I cannot articulate fully, a sense that part of me had stayed on that ridge, forever intertwined with the rhythm of the trees, the wind, and that inexplicable radio static. It is not an ending. It is a continuation, a reminder that life, much like the deep woods, holds mysteries that demand courage, attentiveness, and an openness to the unseen. And in embracing that uncertainty, in acknowledging the delicate balance between fear and wonder, we find a rare clarity, a deep appreciation for the subtle, haunting beauty of the world we inhabit. Now, when I tell this story, I do not speak to scare or to thrill or to boast of an encounter with the unknown. I speak to invite reflection, to stir the sense of awareness that the forest instills in those who venture with respect, with curiosity, and with humility. The empty tent, the radio static, the 2:51 a.m. hour, it all lingers as a reminder that every ridge, every clearing, every path through the Appalachian wild holds a story waiting to test us, to teach us, and to leave an indelible mark on the heart. We leave the Smokies, but the Smokies never leave us. They remain in the quiet tension between wind and leaf, in the hush that follows static, in the echo of every footstep we dare to take into the unknown. And in that final reckoning, as I walk through life far from the ridges of the Smokies, I carry with me a profound understanding that the wild is never just a place. It is a teacher, a mirror, a keeper of truths that can only be grasped by those willing to feel the tension between fear and presence. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call can hold a message if you have the courage to hear it. The empty tent, still vivid in my memory, is no longer a source of mere terror. It is a symbol of the unseen threads that connect us to the world around us, threads that hum in static and whispers, in moments that defy logic yet demand acknowledgement. That ridge that night reshaped my soul in a way that nothing else could, and I have come to understand that the most powerful lessons are not handed to us. They are lived, breathed, feared, and ultimately embraced. The transformation was subtle at first. I found myself noticing the forest in ways I never had before, attuned to the cadence of unseen life, the rhythm of the wind through the trees, the way shadows stretch and fold as though alive. Each hike became more than a journey through terrain. It became a journey through consciousness, a meditation on presence, on humility, and on the fragile boundaries that separate us from forces greater than ourselves. The fear that had once gripped me on Smokies Ridge did not dissipate. It matured into vigilance, into reverence, into a deep, abiding respect for the wildness that exists both around us and within us. It is the kind of fear that does not paralyze, it illuminates. I remember countless nights since walking through forests, camping in remote valleys, always listening. Sometimes the wind carries nothing but silence, yet in the silence I feel the echoes of that static, the whisper of the ridge, the touch of a lesson I cannot entirely explain, and there is a beauty in that mystery, a satisfaction in knowing that not all forces are meant to be controlled or understood. They are meant to be experienced. The Smokies taught me that life is full of these moments, moments where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, where the veil between known and unknown thins, and where we are called to respond, not with panic, but with attention, with courage, with respect. It is a humbling realization. We are small, our time fleeting, yet we are capable of profound perception, capable of bearing witness to the world in ways that honor its depth. I carry this lesson into every aspect of my life, into the mundane and the extraordinary alike. I see more clearly the hidden struggles in people's lives, the quiet victories, the unspoken fears, and I approach them with patience, empathy, and awareness, the same awareness that the ridge demanded of me that night. Fear is no longer a foe, but a guide, a reminder to tread carefully, to listen attentively, and to acknowledge the stories that exist just beyond the edge of perception. As the sun sets now, painting forests and mountains in amber and violet, I think of the hikers who will one day follow the same trails, who may find themselves awake at 2:51 a.m., confronted by the inexplicable. My hope is that they too will listen, will honor the space they enter, and will understand that what seems frightening is often a doorway into understanding, a bridge to perception, a call to awaken to the layers of life that are too easily ignored. The ridge is not just a location on a map. It is a reminder that the world holds mysteries, lessons, and wisdom that are eternal, waiting for those willing to step forward into the unknown with open eyes and steady hearts. In the end, the story of the empty tent and its radio static is not a story of terror alone. It is a story of transformation, of recognition, of awe in the presence of forces greater than ourselves. It is a testament to the power of the forest to shape us, to teach us, to challenge us to confront what we do not understand, and to emerge altered, wiser, and profoundly connected to the world we inhabit. Every ridge, every shadow, every whisper of the wind carries this lesson, that life, like the deep woods, is vast, complex, and full of wonder that can only be embraced with courage, humility, and attention. And so when I close my eyes at night, when I remember the ridge, the empty tent, and the radio's ghostly hum, I do so with gratitude rather than fear. For in that moment of inexplicable presence, I glimpsed a truth too vast for words, that the world is alive in ways we cannot control, that we are part of a greater rhythm, and that the courage to witness, to listen, and to honor the unknown is the truest path to understanding, the truest path to life itself. The Smokies do not just exist outside us, they exist inside, whispering, waiting, teaching. And if we are quiet enough, if we are still enough, if we are brave enough, we hear. I remember the way the forest smelled that night, damp, earthy, and impossibly alive, like it was breathing just for me. My name is Daniel, I'm 32, and I've been hiking the Appalachian Trail for more years than I can count without losing track. There's a strange kind of intimacy in these woods, a closeness that both comforts and unnerves you if you listen too hard. I had set up my small tent on a little clearing along Springer Mountain, the kind of spot locals sometimes call the heart of the ridge, though I knew better than to believe in heart or safety when you're so high above the ordinary world. It was late autumn. The leaves had turned a coppered fire that whispered underfoot, and the chill of the night suggested that winter was already drawing its first shallow breath over the land. I had arrived just as the sun dipped beneath the peaks, carrying with it a gold that slipped through the trees like liquid memory. Setting up my tent was routine, almost meditative. Stakes hammered into frozen soil, rainfly stretched taut. But that night, something was off. Not in the obvious ways, like rustling in the underbrush or snapping branches, but subtler, a weight in the air, an electricity that wasn't supposed to be there. I had checked the weather twice that afternoon, both on my phone and against the old analog readings in my worn Appalachian guidebook. No storms were predicted. Clear skies, low winds, the kind of night where stars glint sharp and infinite. I felt a confidence in that knowledge, a false comfort that made what came next all the more surreal. The first strike came without warning. One instant the forest was quiet, the next a jagged line of light cut through the sky, striking a few yards from my tent. I was thrown backward, the sound deafening, the smell of ozone instant and suffocating. My heart hammered in a rhythm that didn't belong to the night, and I scrambled to my feet, half expecting a storm to barrel over the ridge. But the sky remained clear. Not a cloud, not a whisper of wind. The leaves shimmered in the moonlight, the forest untouched. I blinked, thinking maybe it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, by too many miles on the trail. And then it happened again. A second strike, closer this time, splitting a tree that had stood unbroken for decades. The fear that seized me was not just for my life, though I knew that was at risk. It was a disorienting terror, a kind that makes you question the very logic of the world. Lightning does not strike clear skies. It does not single out the smallest tent on the ridge with deliberate precision, and yet there I was, the epicenter of nature's inexplicable focus. My first instinct was to run, to leave the clearing, to put distance between myself and whatever was hunting in that invisible storm. But another part of me, stubborn and perhaps foolish, held me rooted. Curiosity tangled with fear, twisting into an almost hallucinatory resolve. I had to see what was happening. I had to survive it and understand it. I crouched in the vestibule of my tent, peeking through the mesh like a trapped animal. The next strike illuminated the clearing in violent brilliance, and I saw it. Scorched earth, the outline of where the lightning had struck, but no storm. Not even a flicker of distant clouds. I called out, half expecting someone. Another hiker, a ranger, maybe even a local with knowledge of hidden mountain forces, but my voice was swallowed by the night. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath to see what I would do. I realized then that survival was more than stepping out of the way. It was about understanding the rhythm of the impossible, about reading the signals I had ignored for years, thinking instinct was enough. As the night deepened, I noticed a pattern, subtle but undeniable. Each strike seemed drawn not just to me, but to the edges of the clearing, the old roots, the gnarled branches that clawed skyward like desperate hands. I began to move carefully, testing the soil with the tip of my boot, noticing where the tension in the air thickened and where it seemed to thin. The forest itself became a teacher, whispering warnings in the faint hum between strikes. I didn't know what force was directing this lightning, only that it respected no human logic, no trail markers, no maps. And yet, in observing, in slowing myself down, I found a rhythm, a way to move, to breathe, to exist within the eye of this invisible predatory storm. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell, the forest losing all sense of linear time. My flashlight lay unused. I had stopped caring about illumination, focusing instead on instinct sharpened to a fine, desperate edge. The strikes continued, never hitting me directly, but always close enough to ignite the primal fire in my chest that screamed, "You are not safe." I realized then that the fear wasn't just about death. It was about the illusion of control, the fragile pride we carry into places where nature doesn't negotiate. Each strike that missed me felt like a rebuke, a lesson in humility that was both terrifying and sacred. I had come to these mountains seeking adventure, seeking stories, seeking the solitude of the deep woods, and the mountains were reminding me that the wild does not owe us understanding or mercy. Morning arrived without ceremony, the first thin light brushing the ridge like an uncertain hand. The clearing bore the scars of night, singed patches of earth, a tree split as clean as if an axe had fallen, the air still tinged with ozone. I emerged from my tent, limbs trembling, eyes scanning for some logical explanation, some rational cause. But the world was calm, impossibly so. Birds sang, leaves rustled with ordinary wind, and the sky held only the pale promise of day. I realized I was alone, truly alone, and yet something within me had shifted. The fear had not left. It had been refined, channeled into a sharp awareness that would linger with me for years to come. I learned that night that the woods are never random. They are patient, deliberate, and sometimes cruel. And that lesson, hard as it was, became the measure of my respect for the mountains. I packed up slowly, every movement deliberate, every glance over my shoulder a reminder that what had happened was not a fluke. As I descended Springer Mountain, my steps measured and careful, I thought about what it means to be human in a world that refuses to bend to our understanding. The forest holds secrets, yes, but it also offers insight. If we listen, if we watch, if we let our fear teach us rather than paralyze us. I carried that lesson down the ridge and into the days that followed, that caution and reverence are inseparable companions on trails like these, that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to move through it, and that some nights in the woods will challenge you not with visible monsters, but with the raw, invisible forces that remind you how small and precious you are. I descended the ridge with a careful, almost reverent pace, each footfall a silent acknowledgement that the night had left its mark on me, not just on the forest floor, but deep in my chest, where adrenaline and awe tangled into something I couldn't name. The trail wound like a memory through stands of oak and hemlock, roots rising like veins, reminding me that even the smallest misstep could mean disaster. Every snapped twig underfoot made me flinch, every distant caw of a raven or rustle of leaves a ghostly echo of the strikes that had haunted the clearing. I kept telling myself that daylight would bring reason, that morning light would clarify what had felt so chaotic and malevolent. But the fear had settled into my bones, quiet now, but patient and persistent, like a shadow that refuses to leave even when the sun burns it away. By the time I reached the small creek that cut across the lower slope, I paused to kneel and drink. The water was icy, bracing, and in its clarity I saw more than my reflection. I saw a man who had survived the impossible, who had faced something beyond comprehension and lived. But survival was not enough. The forest had demanded a reckoning, and I had given it my awareness, my humility, my complete attention. I thought of the lightning, silent and invisible in its judgment, and I understood that the mountains are not cruel out of spite. They are exacting, meticulous, indifferent. To walk among them is to submit, even briefly, to forces that do not negotiate, that do not explain, that simply exist. And within that submission, there is clarity. There is a strange, piercing kind of freedom that comes only when you realize the world does not revolve around your expectations, and that life, even on a quiet ridge, is both fragile and extraordinary. I made camp again that night, farther down the trail, in a hollow where trees crowded close and seemed to whisper warnings of their own. Sleep came reluctantly, chased away by the memory of strikes that had passed through the air like a predator stalking invisible prey. My dreams were filled with fractured images, the tree splitting, the faint hum of electricity, the way my heart had thumped against my ribs like a drum. When I awoke, the forest was calm, ordinary in its deceptive simplicity. Yet I carried the echo of the night with me, a pulse beneath my own heartbeat, a reminder that the woods do not forget, that they do not forgive ignorance, and that the line between adventure and peril is thinner than the thinnest root I had tripped over on the trail. Weeks later, when I shared the story with other hikers and locals, some nodded knowingly, others laughed politely, unable to reconcile the tale with their own understanding of storms and lightning. But I knew the truth. I had been singled out, not by malice, but by the sheer unpredictability of the world, by the raw presence of a wilderness that is alive in ways we cannot always perceive. That night had taught me more than any guidebook or map ever could. It had taught me patience, attentiveness, humility, and the courage to act in the absence of understanding. I had learned that the deep woods do not reward ignorance or arrogance. Only those willing to move with awareness, to respect forces greater than themselves, and to carry their lessons forward with quiet reverence. And now, as I sit by a campfire years later, recounting that night on Springer Mountain, I feel the same mixture of awe and fear I felt when the first strike split the clearing. The forest is still alive, still watching, still teaching in its invisible ways. Lightning may strike in empty clearings, storms may arrive without warning, and the world may refuse to explain why. But each of us who ventures into the deep woods carries the capacity to respond, to survive, and to grow. The fear, the awe, the silence between strikes, they are not just obstacles, they are lessons. They are the forest speaking directly to the heart, reminding us that life is not predictable, that survival is never guaranteed, and that wisdom is forged in moments when the ordinary rules dissolve, leaving only presence, attention, and courage. The trail continues, as it always does, winding endlessly through ridges and hollows, over streams and under canopies that hum with life unseen. And I continue with it, step by careful step, the memory of that night etched into every fiber of my being. I know now that the mountains are not simply a backdrop for adventure. They are a crucible for understanding, a mirror reflecting our smallest and bravest selves alike. When I reach a clearing in the early hours, when the moon casts silver light across the leaves, I pause, heart alert, mind sharp, and I listen, not for storms, not for lightning, but for the quiet, unyielding voice of the forest that once chose me as its solitary witness, and still, in its own inscrutable way, teaches me what it means to truly walk among the wild. I remember the moment it fully sank in, while descending a narrow stretch of the trail, the ridge steep on either side, the forest pressing close, almost suffocating in its stillness. The fear of that night had not vanished. It had transformed. settling into a quiet vigilance, a kind of reverent alertness that I carried like a second skin. Every snapped twig underfoot, every distant bird call, every rustle of unseen animals reminded me that the world was alive in ways I could not control, that danger and wonder often occupy the same space, and that the line between them is invisible until it is crossed. I thought about the lightning strikes, each one precise, each one deliberate, and I realized they were less an attack and more a challenge, a test of attention, patience, and humility. It was as though the mountain itself was asking, "Do you see me? Do you understand the rules of my domain?" By the time I reached the lower slopes, the sun had begun to stretch its fingers through the trees, painting the forest floor in golds and amber. The scars of the previous night were still visible, branches blackened and jagged, small patches of earth burned and hollowed, and yet, in the midst of destruction, life continued. Moss and mushrooms had already begun reclaiming the scorched patches. Tiny insects crawled over fallen bark, and birds flitted between treetops as if nothing had happened. I understood then that the forest does not dwell on chaos or misfortune. It simply endures, adapts, and teaches those willing to witness. I knelt, running my hands over the damp soil, letting the smell of ozone and pine fill my lungs, and felt a gratitude deeper than words, a bond with the wild that only the truly tested can know. As I resumed the trail, I reflected on how unprepared I had been, not in terms of gear or physical fitness, but in mindset. I had believed that knowledge, maps, and experience could shield me from the unpredictability of nature. I had been wrong. That night had stripped away my arrogance and left me with clarity. The woods demand respect, and respect is shown not through confidence or bravado, but through attentiveness, patience, and a willingness to listen. I had learned to notice the subtle cues in the air, the changes in tension in the wind, the almost imperceptible hum that precedes electrical discharge. I had learned that survival is as much about perception as it is about speed or strength, and that fear, when faced with calm awareness, becomes a teacher rather than a tormentor. By midday, I had descended to a small clearing where a creek widened into a shallow pool. I stopped, letting the water wash over my hands, and looked up at the sky. Blue stretched endlessly above, punctuated by drifting clouds, the memory of night lightning feeling surreal against the serenity of the day. Yet I could still feel it, an echo, a pulse running through the air, a lingering presence that defied explanation. And I realized that the true gift of that night was not merely survival, it was transformation. I was no longer just a hiker, a wanderer seeking the thrill of the trail. I was a witness, a participant in something far larger than myself, attuned to a force that does not bend to human understanding. That understanding was terrifying, yes, but also liberating. It freed me from the illusion that the world could be predicted, that I could fully control my fate, that danger was always obvious. I had glimpsed the raw, chaotic heartbeat of the mountains, and it had not crushed me. It had shaped me. The descent continued, each step a meditation, each breath a reminder of the night's lessons. When I finally reached the lower campgrounds, where other hikers laughed around fires and the smell of cooked meals hung in the air, I felt simultaneously part of the world and apart from it. I could rejoin the ordinary rhythms of life, but I carried within me a story that no casual observer could comprehend fully. That night on Springer Mountain had rewritten the rules for me. What I once feared as uncontrollable and random was, in truth, a mirror of the limits of my own perception. The forest had shown me that existence is unpredictable, that danger and beauty coexist inseparably, and that courage is found not in defeating fear, but in moving forward with eyes wide open. In the weeks and months that followed, I found myself returning to that night in thought, unraveling the memory with a kind of reverent obsession. Each retelling, each reflection deepened my understanding. I realized that fear is not weakness. It is attention. It is connection. It is a signal to align yourself with forces far greater than your own. I also realized that adventure carries lessons far beyond the physical challenges of terrain and weather. It is a journey into awareness, into the depths of human perception, into the recognition that life is fragile, precious, and infinitely unpredictable. The lightning that struck my solitary campsite was not a natural phenomenon. It was a punctuation, a message, a sacred confrontation that left me with scars I could neither see nor measure, but could feel in every heartbeat. And so whenever I return to the Appalachian trails, whenever I pitch my tent on a ridge or in a hollow, I carry that night like a talisman. I do not seek to tempt fate or test luck. I seek only to move with the forest, to notice what it offers, and to honor the lessons it imparts. Every creaking branch, every flicker of wind, every distant flash of light reminds me that the mountains are alive, that they speak in forms we may never fully understand, and that the measure of a hiker, a camper, a human is not how much ground they cover, but how fully they heed the call of the wild. That night on Springer Mountain was not just an encounter with lightning. It was an encounter with the raw, unyielding truth of the world, and surviving it was not an act of luck, but a baptism in attention, patience, and respect. The wind was sharp against my face, carrying the scent of damp pine and the faint metallic tang of an approaching storm. I remember standing on the edge of McAfee Knob that night. The ridge stretched out before me like the spine of some ancient beast, shadows pooling in the valleys below. My name is Caleb, 32, born and raised just a few hours from the Appalachians, yet nothing in all those years had prepared me for what I would hear echo through these woods that evening. I had set out alone, a simple attempt to escape the city's constant noise, to find solace in the familiar crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the rhythmic pulse of my own heartbeat blending with the sighs of the wind. At first, it was the usual stillness that greeted me, a quiet so deep that the faint snap of a twig or the low rustle of a squirrel felt deafening. I laughed softly to myself, thinking of how dramatic I must have seemed, standing on the precipice, staring into darkness that had no end. But then came the first sound that froze me mid-step, the sound of a voice, a distant, wavering call, almost swallowed by the night. It was difficult to make sense of it at first. The voice was faint, carried on the wind, barely more than a whisper. I paused, heart accelerating, scanning the horizon as if the trees themselves might move to reveal its source. "Help," it said again, clearer this time, edged with a panic that tightened my chest like a vice. I knew, logically, that I was alone on that trail. The nearest hiker, at least a few miles down the mountain, wouldn't be able to call out and have me hear them like this. And yet, there it was, a human cry, immediate and real, tugging at instincts older than reason. I checked my pack. Flashlight, extra batteries, first aid kit, all present. My phone, though, was dead, a casualty of overuse and neglect. The kind of mistake that felt small until the night stretches infinitely ahead. My mind raced. Should I follow the sound? Could it be someone stranded, someone falling behind on a familiar trail? And then, almost as quickly, the voice stopped, leaving only the wind and my uneven breathing. I moved cautiously, each step deliberate on the slick rocks, listening intently for another call, another clue. The forest seemed to shift around me. Trees that were once companions now loomed like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the night sky. The voice came again, lower this time, a desperate whisper threading through the rustling leaves. "Please, I'm here." It was human, undeniably so, and yet there was something strange about the tone, as if it were coming from somewhere both near and impossibly far. I froze, trying to trace it to a direction, but the sound fractured as the wind changed course, leaving me disoriented. Fear began to seep into the edges of my mind. Not the flashy, adrenaline-driven fear of a sudden stumble or fall, but the deeper, gnawing kind that settles quietly and refuses to leave. A part of me wanted to turn back, to retreat to the familiarity of my car and the comforting hum of streetlights, yet another part of me, the part that had chased adventure up these mountains countless times, would not ignore someone in need. I called back, my voice brittle but firm. "I hear you. Where are you?" My words were swallowed almost instantly. the night absorbing sound like water into soil. I moved toward a slope that seemed to tilt in the direction of the calls, careful not to rush, knowing one misstep could send me tumbling into darkness. Each shadow seemed to stretch, each rock to shift beneath my gaze. Then I saw it, a small figure, slumped against a tree, half hidden in underbrush, illuminated briefly by a flashlight I had forgotten I carried. Relief surged first, quickly followed by confusion. The figure was me, or at least a perfect double, down to the jacket and the worn boots. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots, and when I looked again, there was nothing. No one. No figure. Just the echo of a voice calling softly into the void. I spent the next hour moving cautiously along the ridge, the calls coming intermittently, sometimes from the right, sometimes from the left, always impossibly distant, yet agonizingly close. My rational mind searched for an explanation, a prank, an echo, some lost hiker, but deep down I knew this was different. The forest itself seemed to bend around the sound, shaping it, guiding it, perhaps even creating it. I shouted again, more urgently this time, and the voice repeated my words back to me, warped, stretched, a distorted mirror of my own desperation. It was no longer simply a call for help. It was a reflection of the fear, the solitude, and the vulnerability I had carried with me into these woods. As the night deepened, rain began to drizzle, cold and insistent, soaking the jacket that now clung to my skin. I realized that my own experience was being rewritten by something outside my comprehension. The calls had a rhythm, a pattern I could not yet place, yet instinctively followed. Each echo led me closer to the edge of the ridge, where the fog hung thick like a veil between the earth and sky. And then, at exactly 8:27 p.m., as I reached the narrowest point overlooking the valley below, the voice spoke my name. Not just a call for help, not a reflection, but my name, spoken with the urgency and intimacy of someone who had watched my every step for hours. I stopped, breath caught, heart thundering. And in that suspended moment, the wind died, the trees fell silent, and the world seemed to hold its breath with me. I knelt there, listening, unable to move, unable to call, as the fog shifted, revealing only the barest hint of a trail descending into the unseen. The voice came once more, almost human, almost desperate, yet undeniably from somewhere that should not exist, between reality and something else entirely. It was then I realized that this was not about finding someone lost, not about rescuing another hiker. It was about confronting the echoes within myself, the fears I had tried to bury, the loneliness I had disguised with purposeful adventure. I had come to the mountains seeking solitude, and instead, I found reflection, a voice, impossibly external, reminding me of everything I had ignored. I stayed there until the rain ceased, until the fog began to thin, until the first faint hints of dawn turned the horizon a timid gray. When I finally descended, following the trail carefully, I found no evidence of anyone else, no figure, no footprints, no sign that the calls had been anything other than whispers of the night. And yet, I felt changed. The mountains had taught me that fear is not always a signal to flee. Sometimes it is a guide. Sometimes it is a mirror, reflecting the parts of ourselves we rarely confront in the safety of day. The voice, whoever or whatever it was, had led me not into danger, but into awareness, into understanding, into the realization that some calls for help are not for others to answer. They are for us to hear, to recognize, and to acknowledge within our own hearts. I returned home damp and exhausted, carrying a quiet intensity that I could not shake. Friends asked me about my hike, about McAfee Knob, and I told them the usual details, the ridge, the fog, the rain, but I could not bring myself to recount the voice. Some experiences are too intimate, too fragile, too raw for casual conversation. And yet, late at night, when the house is still, I sometimes hear it again, carried on the wind through the cracks of memory, a voice calling for help long after rescue, a reminder that some lessons, some echoes remain with us, persistent, haunting, illuminating, until we finally understand what it truly means to listen. To listen. The days after that night were quiet in the kind of way that felt unnatural. I went back to work, walked the familiar streets, and yet everything seemed sharper, louder, more intrusive than before. I would catch myself pausing mid-step, listening for a voice that would never come again. Or would it? There was a lingering tension in my chest, a rhythm of anticipation I could not dismiss. Friends noticed my silence, my tendency to stare into corners of rooms as if listening for something they could not hear. I avoided the woods at first, the place that had been my refuge now tinged with uncertainty, with the memory of a voice that had been unmistakably human, yet undeniably other. I told myself it had been exhaustion, an echo carried by the wind, a trick of the mind. But a part of me, deep and stubborn, refused to accept such easy explanations. There was something real in that sound, something that had chosen me, that had demanded to be heard. Weeks passed before I returned to the Appalachian Trail, drawn by the need to reconcile fear with curiosity. I approached McAfee Knob with a heightened awareness, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves amplified in my senses. It was not the mountains themselves that scared me now, but the idea of missing something important, of ignoring the subtle signals that life, nature, or whatever else it might be, was constantly trying to give. I moved slowly, deliberately, the weight of the previous night pressing against my ribs with every step. I carried no illusions this time. I would not rush. I would not force my presence on the unknown. I would listen. And as I reached the ridge, the sun low on the horizon, I felt it again, a faint vibration in the air, a subtle energy that made my skin prickle. Not a voice, not yet, but a reminder that the mountains remember, that they observe, and that some encounters demand patience, reverence, and humility. That hike, I realized, was less about finding someone or something lost and more about discovering how deeply we are tethered to fear, to curiosity, and to the parts of ourselves that we often refuse to confront. Every step on the trail became a meditation on presence, a negotiation with the uncertainty that had gripped me the night before. I noticed the way the fog curled around rocks, how the wind threaded through the trees, how the distant calls of birds and the faint rustle of unseen animals created a rhythm, a dialogue that I had been blind to before. I understood, slowly, that my own anxiety had shaped my perception. I had been so intent on rescuing that I almost missed the lesson embedded in the echoes. Fear does not always signal danger. Sometimes it is the language of understanding, of awareness, of seeing beyond the surface. As evening fell, the sun dropping behind the ridges, I paused at the same spot where I had first heard the calls. The valley below swirled with mist, the last light of day dimming to a muted gray. I closed my eyes, inhaled the damp, earthy scent of pine and soil, and waited. The silence stretched, profound and almost holy in its intensity. Then, almost imperceptibly, a whisper of sound reached me. Not a voice, not a cry, but a vibration, a resonance that seemed to echo my own heartbeat. And in that moment, I understood the truth of what had happened. The voice, the calls, the disorienting echoes of that night had been a reflection, a mirror of my own vulnerability, my own humanity. I had heard the fear and desperation that we all carry, the subtle urgencies that we try to ignore. The mountains had not endangered me. They had opened a channel into myself that I had long neglected. I descended from McAfee Knob that night with a new understanding of silence, of listening, and of presence. The voice never returned in the same way, but I felt it in subtler forms, the pattern of the wind, the quiet pauses in conversation, the sudden awareness of someone else's unspoken need. It was a hum beneath the surface of life, reminding me that help, understanding, and connection often arrive in forms we cannot anticipate. The trail had taught me to move slowly, to be attentive, to let fear guide curiosity rather than panic, and to recognize that some rescues are not about saving another person, but about answering the call within ourselves. Returning home, I carried the memory like a compass, a persistent thread weaving through my daily life. Each night when I lay in bed, I could hear faint echoes of that ridge, the wind, the fog, the voice. And instead of dread, I felt reverence. I realized that our encounters with the unknown, whether in the deep woods or in our own lives, are not always warnings. Sometimes they are invitations to see clearly, to pay attention, to listen when we have previously been deaf to subtle truths. I found myself approaching relationships, challenges, and personal reflections with a heightened sensitivity, guided by an awareness born from that singular night. The mountains had called, the echo had answered, and in that interplay I had discovered resilience, attentiveness, and a profound unspoken courage. Even now, years later, the lessons linger. I hike often, alone or with others, but always with a deeper respect for the space around me and the silence that carries voices unseen. McAfee Knob is no longer just a destination. It is a teacher, a reminder of how fragile yet tenacious the human experience is. The voice I heard, the calls that resonated through the fog and darkness, are etched in my memory as a symbol of attention, empathy, and the unseen threads that connect us to the world and to each other. And every time I hear the wind twist through the trees or the faint rustle of the forest floor, I feel a connection to that night, a reminder that the extraordinary often hides within the ordinary, waiting for someone willing to pause, listen, and answer the call. In the end, McAfee Knob taught me more than any guidebook or trail map ever could. It reminded me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face uncertainty with awareness. That sometimes the most profound rescues occur not in saving another, but in answering the echo within ourselves. That the woods, the mountains, and the nights stretching into unknown territory carry lessons disguised as voices, and that to truly live, we must attune ourselves to them. And as I continue to walk these trails, I carry the resonance of that night, the haunting yet instructive calls that came long after rescue, shaping not only the way I hike, but the way I inhabit my own life, with attentiveness, humility, and the courage to listen, even when the world is silent.